Hey everybody, welcome back to Scale Skills. This is Preparatory Level, Lesson 2, covering page 3 in the book, G Major. So our last lesson, Lesson 1, we covered C Major, and we basically covered a format or a series of patterns that you're going to experience throughout the next several pages of this book. Basically, what you're doing today in G major is you're transposing from C major. And some of you may not know what that means, transposing. Well, basically, everything you played on page 2 is in a key. And that key was C major, which basically means no sharps or flats. You're going to be playing the 5-finger position in one chord, the scale, the chord progression, and the arpeggio in the key of G. So essentially, you're playing the exact same thing, but in a different key. So yes, it's different notes and maybe some different fingering, but probably not. And there's a key signature, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, basically the next several pages, you're doing what you did on page 2. You're just doing it in different keys. So that might make more sense as we go forward in today's lesson. So here we are on page 3, G major. Now, the first thing you want to know about G major is that whether it's the one chord or the scale itself or an arpeggio, the first note starts on G. So that's part of what makes these keys, work. C major started on C, G major starts on G. Now, I just mentioned a moment ago that C major had no sharps or flats in the key signature. So if you look at the top of page 3 under G major where it says 5-finger position in the one chord, look at the beginning of the grand staff there. Right beside the treble clef and the bass clef, we see a sharp sign. Now those are F sharps. And that's our key signature for G major. In the key of G, all Fs are sharped. So it's not just that specific F that you see in the treble clef, which is here on the keyboard. And it's not just that specific F down here in the bass clef. It's actually all Fs. All Fs are sharped across the piano. So any F you see will automatically be an F sharp. Okay? You won't be playing all those today, but you'll be playing a couple octaves worth of Fs, and they will all automatically be sharped. So I'll go through that as we encounter them. So with this 5-finger position, your very first note is G. So like I was saying just a moment ago as well, if we're in the key of G major, a lot of these patterns and things are going to start on G. So in the treble clef, the right hand, you're going to go to what's called the G position. So your thumb is on G, and basically you're putting 2 on A, 3 on B, 5 on C, and, 1 on G, 2 on A, 3 on B, 4 on C, and 5 on D. And that's actually the first 5 notes of this 5-finger position. So starting at the beginning of that line in the right hand, you've got G, A, B, C, D, and you're going to come back down to C, B, A, and finally G. You're going to do the same thing in the left hand. So here's your left hand position, 1 octave lower than the right hand position. So again, 1 octave means if I start on this G and I count down 8 notes, this G is going to be included as 1 note. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this G is 1 octave lower. But it's the same thing in the left hand. So starting with your 5th finger on G, you've got G, A, B, C, D, back down to C, B, A, and G. Now before we go on to the one chord, let's focus on this 5-position pattern with both hands together. So make sure you got your position and then you're ready to go on G, A, B, C, D, C, B, A, and this G is 3 counts because it's a dotted half note, and then you're off on beat 4 for that quarter rest. So keep in mind they're all quarter notes in the first 2 measures, so just a nice, slow, even tempo. When we get to our final measure, that's the one chord. So the one chord is always built off the first note of the scale, which the first note of the scale is actually the name of the key we're playing in, G major. So G. And to build a chord, I'm going to do it in the right hand first. A chord is built of thirds. So in other words, from G to B is a third. and then another third up from B is D. So basically it's that first, third, and fifth note of that 5-finger pattern. So you're kind of outlining the chords just a moment ago. Same thing in the left hand. So 5th finger on G, B, and D. And so in that last measure, you're gonna play them both together and hold it for 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that little quarter rest at the end of the third measure is just to give us a little bit of time to get to that chord. So let's play the entire line straight through with a little count off. 1, 2, ready, go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And hit that chord nice and strong. You want to have all 6 notes total here, 3 and 3, sound like 1. You don't want any of this. You want it all together as one sound. So you have to practice that. And as always, the key to making that work is curved fingers. Get curved fingers so those fingertips really have a lot of control over what you're doing. All right, so let's move down to scale, tetrachord form. We talked about this in the previous lesson, what tetrachord form is. So a tetrachord, as review, I'm going to start down on this low G here in the bass clef. So this is another octave lower than where you just were in the bass clef, because this is the first G that's written on this sheet music here for scale. So a tetrachord is, let me remember now. Okay, it's 4 notes, and they're built off of this pattern of whole, whole, half step. Okay, so G, go up a whole step. Remember, you skip a key for a whole step, would be A. So that's your second note. From A, another whole step up would be B, and then a half step from B is C. So that's basically your 4 notes in the first measure, and that is a tetrachord. Okay, in your next measure, notice it says RH above it. RH is a right hand, so your right hand's going to be playing in bass clef. So your second finger is actually going to hit this D, not your thumb, but your second finger. So you're not using your thumbs at all. And again, a 4-note, a tetrachord is 4 notes. So D to E is the first whole step. E to, not F, but F sharp, right? Because key signature. And actually it works. Think about it. Tetrachord, once again, is 4 notes joined by whole step, half step. So even if you don't know the key signature, or don't remember your key signature for G, say we're going up from D, the next note is a whole step up. So skip a key, and that's E. And then we said it's another whole step. Well, an F would be a half step from E, right? So a whole step makes sense because it fits the pattern of the tetrachord, and it also confirms, F sharp in our key. So when in doubt, the tetrachord form actually always solves the scale for you. And then from the F sharp, a half step would be G. So there's our scale. So again, as you play this with both hands, notice you're not going to use your thumbs at all. So just kind of keep them down and out. And you're going to start back at the beginning with your left hand. So we got G, A, B, C. Now the right hand, D, E, F sharp, G. Come back down, F sharp, E, D, C, B, A, and G for 2 counts. Okay, well, let's do it one more time with the count off. 1, 2, ready, go. So that covers the scale. Now in the third line, chord progression, let's look at the first 2 measures. So the chord progression is focusing on root position. Some of this I explained in the previous lesson, and I'll review it. When you have a root position chord such as G major, that means you're putting the G at the bottom of the chord. Okay, G is always the root of a G chord, but root position means you're putting that G at the bottom. Okay, so think about a plant, the roots in the ground. Okay, that would be root position if the plant is actually in the ground and the roots are at the bottom. However, if I pulled that plant out of the ground and flipped it upside down, so I put the G at the top up here, G's still the root. right? The roots of that plant are still its roots, but it's not in root position. I flipped it around. Okay, so going back, root position chords in both hands, we've got our 1 chord, which we did earlier at the end of the first line. So in both hands, you've got the G chord. So the G chord's the 1 chord because it's built off the first note of the scale. And you can see a Roman numeral 1 underneath the bass clef. Now we're going to our 5 chord. Our 5 chord is D, specifically D major. 5 notes up from G is D. And we're going to play that D in root position. So that means from the G chord, you're going to have to jump up to the D chord. Now I said D major because if I don't sharp my F, this would be something called a D minor chord, but it's not. It's a D major because of the F sharp. It has a bright, happy sound. So don't forget your F sharps in both hands. So the hardest thing about root position chords is jumping. So you got to practice jumping from G all the way up to D. Keep in mind, though, on the G chord, what's the top note in root position? D's. What's the bottom note of the D chord? D. So you're going from here, pinky right hand, thumb left hand, to thumb right hand, pinky left hand. So that D is kind of your anchor. It's anchoring those 2 chords. It's also called a common tone, which we'll get to in just a moment. And of course, you're coming back to the G chord. So these 2 measures is just G, D, and G, just jumping around. So remember, as you practice these, don't worry about tempo so much. What I'd like for you to do is after you jump up from the G chord, make sure everything's lined up in both hands before you play the D chord. So you want to have a good, solid sound. Same thing when you go back to G. Make sure everything's lined up, and then push it down. Okay, so that's all that is right there. In the bass clef, you notice that the way it's written, it looks a little bit harder than it is. It starts in bass clef with the left hand, but the D chord, it says treble clef. So if you read treble clef, that is in fact a D, F sharp, and an A. The reason they wrote it for your left hand in treble clef is because if we wrote it in bass clef, the notes would be so far above the bass clef staff, it'd be really hard to read. So in this case, it's actually easier to see it in treble clef. But what's even easier than that is just focus on what's happening on the keyboard. You're going from a G chord, and both hands 1 octave apart, up to D chord. Both hands 1 octave apart, and then back to those G chords. So really, I find that this is something easier to see on the keyboard than even on the sheet music. Once you recognize what it is on the sheet music, then you can focus on the keys. Now the last 2 measures, this is common tone. So when I played the G chord, and I went to the D chord, remember I said the D was the same note. That's your common tone. So what happens sometimes in music is staying on that same common tone and revoicing or inverting the next chord. Now, the book does this. Instead of making the next chord a D chord, they make it a D7. So a D7, here's a D chord. A D7 puts a note 7 notes above D. So 7 notes above D would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the addition of the C makes it a D7 chord. And the fingering, by the way, typically for a 4-note chord is 1, 2, 3, and 5 in your right hand. Typically, not always. But think about it this way. 4-note chord, don't use your 4th finger, and that will work out nicely. The other thing, so there's a couple things with that D7 chord. One, it's inverted. So it's actually F sharp, C, and D. The D's at the top. And they omitted this A because it's the 5th, and the 5th is not that important. So you're left with F sharp, C, and D. Now, the cool thing about this is from the G chord, look how my hand has to move to the D7. Doesn't have to move. What actually moves is my fingers. So it's easier for the hand because you're not jumping. It's harder on the fingers though because you got to get more finger work in. But that's all part of piano. So, but it creates a much smoother sound than if I jumped up. You hear that? That's not really that pleasant at all. So inverting the chord, keeping the common tone in the same place, makes it much smoother, both for your hands and musically. your left hand's doing the exact same thing. So we got G chords. We've got the 5-7, which is D7. First inversion, it says there. So if you're wondering first inversion, if I've got, let's see, F sharp, D, and F sharp, C, and D. Remember we said root position puts the name of that chord at the bottom, which would be D. So let me put D at the bottom. So D, F sharp, and C now. That's root position. When I flip the D's up an octave, that's first inversion. I inverted it one time. Now I can invert this chord again. I could put F sharps at the top. Let's see, how am I fingering? There's probably several options for fingering on that. But that's second inversion. And if I flip it again, I'm actually back to root position. Now, don't worry if you don't get all of that right now. This will come in time, and that's really more theory than this book goes into. I mean, this book is more about, just learning some basic techniques and progressions and things with your chord. But in case you're wondering, what is first inversion? That is it. So again, we've got G chord in both hands, the D7. Keep in mind your fingering. 1, 4, and 5 in the right hand, 5, 2, and 1 in the left hand, and then back to that G chord. So take your time, lining up all the notes before playing. Same thing when you go back to the G chord. I don't care if it takes a minute. Line it up so that when you play, it's solid. And then you can work on, the timing and getting faster, but that will take time. So this is a good exercise to just, practice going through these a little bit every day. A couple minutes a day, you do that, I guarantee in a week, it'll be solid. A couple weeks, it'll be like nothing. The arpeggio is the last thing at the very bottom. The arpeggio is basically a broken chord. This is a block chord when I play all 3 notes of the G chord. When I play them one at a time, that's a broken chord. Now, if I do that across several octaves, that's an arpeggio. So and there's a lot of ways you can do arpeggios. You can go several octaves, you can do different fingering and all. But this fingering works really well. We've got 5, 3, and 1 for our broken G chord in the left hand. 1, 3, and 5 in the right hand. In the third measure, you're going to cross that 2 over to G in the left hand. Now, what I want you to do is cross it while the right hand's playing. So you're right there in time. You don't want this to happen. See, I took too long. It's steady quarter notes, 3 beats per measure. There's no pausing. You've got to practice or figure out ways to keep the music going. So that's how you do it. As soon as you're done in the left hand, start bringing it over, and you're right there. Same thing when you come back down. That thumb needs to be right there on D in time. So you don't want to be up here and then keep going and then say, whoops, I forgot. It's too late. Too much time has passed. Now you can go slow, of course. That also gives you more time. But you still have the evenness, which is what we're always after. So no sweat because my left hand was already there. So the left hand's got to practice going to 2 on G and back to thumb on D. And you can just do what I'm doing right now. Practice this a bunch. Keep your right hand there though, because it's going to be going over your right hand. There's no sense of practicing it without the right hand, because what happens is you're going to adjust the left hand to move maybe straight across. You can't do that if the right hand's there. So you got to practice with your right hand there though, because you got to make this big curve. Okay, let's do the whole line of arpeggio. The whole arpeggio line one more time. I'll give a count off. 1, 2, 3. And these motions with bringing that left hand back and forth, just keep it nice and smooth. Let it, flow like the music is flowing. And then your music will keep flowing. So, all right, that covers G major on page 3. So spend some time on this. And again, remember, it's everything you did in C major. You're just transposing it, meaning you're playing it now in the key of G. So you're taking everything you did here in C, like this 5-finger position, you're doing it up on G. Different notes, but it's the same pattern, right? A similar sound even. So that's called transposition, when you play the exact same thing from one key and take it and play it in another key. All right, I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.